How's it going, everyone? Just give me a moment while I wait for Nick to sign in and we'll get going. There he is. Nick, you there? I think you don't have your camera turned on.
Yeah, make me host real quick. I got to change the settings. That's my fault.
Oh, I can hear you now.
There we go.
What did you say about?
Make me host and I can fix the camera. We already have a question. What is on the shirt?
What is on the shirt? I think they're pineapples.
Yeah, maybe.
It's some sort of fruit. Fairly sure it's a pineapple.
All right. Let me make you host again so that you are the boss.
Oof. I don't know if I want that responsibility.
Yeah, well, what's done is done. No takebacks.
Dan says my shirt looks like I have little coronaviruses on it. That might, yeah, that's.
Yep, that's what it is. That's actually exactly what the coronavirus looks like.
That's right.
All right. So we're back on track with cash flow engineering. And I'm actually going to stop my video again because bandwidth.
Oh no. Now I'm stuck just looking at myself. It's terrible.
Yeah, internet's struggling. Internet has been struggling the last couple of days. So back on track with cash flow engineering. Tuesdays are cash flow engineering days. Any questions you have about the previous, we taught it live. It's in the member area, and we're going to continue to roll out new things, including case studies as this gets implemented and we recognize leverage points in particular industries and all that stuff. So I'll shoot it back to Dan since he's the host with the fancy shirt.
With my coronavirus shirt on. Drop questions in. I think maybe the most common question that I've had over the last couple weeks is around how to restructure their business to kind of relaunch, in particular around moving fixed costs to variable costs. And so I guess just to step back, I don't recall which meeting or what sequence, maybe you do, Nick, where we talked about this whole idea that there's the rhythm of our business, which is correlated to the industry and as well as business decisions that we've made, but then also we inject risk into the business or as well based off the way that we make decisions. And often because we're the only shareholder or we have a couple of shareholders. And so we can inject this kind of additional risk. Do you remember which unit we covered that in, Nick?
I do not, but I will go through and I'll drop it in the notes here.
I don't know that it's super important, but it's this whole idea that, and I think I share this personal anecdote that I'm not allowed to make new decisions from January 1st to January 15th. Because I'm just pissed off during that period of time. Coming back from break, we close our office from the 24th through the end of the year. And also that's the period of time when we're sending out a lot of engagement letters for our tax-only clients. And then, oh, by the way, we pay out bonuses January 15th. And so there's just this confluence of things that are happening that are business decisions that we've made in terms of the timing of when we'll send out engagement letters, although there's some industry element to that. But certainly a business decision to close the office as well as a business decision to pay out bonuses when we do. And I just feel grumpy about it. I just feel grumpy about paying out the bonuses in particular. Even though people have earned them and we've gone through this whole methodology to calculate it, I just see this sum of money in my account that is going to no longer be in my account, and I feel mad about it. And then also fueled by the the internal pressure I have around getting these engagement letters signed. And so I've just observed that every year I'm grumpy during that period of time. And so then I'm not allowed to change things because there's a good chance that I'm wanting to solve a problem that can't actually be solved without introducing additional volatility and changing when we send out engagement letters or changing when we're paying the bonus. We're just moving the problem to a different period of time. And unfortunately, by making that change, we don't have any comparability. And so I want to share that nuance for all of you to think about. What are the things that you're doing that create risks that are reaction to maybe your emotional state? Because what I have seen in conversations I've had with folks about restarting their business is that for a number of the conversations I've had is that the biggest risk that they have thus far is the function of being a people pleaser. Now I'm a recovering people pleaser, so no judgment. One of the people I work with specializes in working with men who are people pleasers. So it's a problem that I know that I have. And so it's not to suggest that everyone that's on this call is a people pleaser. So I'm not trying to pass on that judgment, but a number of the issues that I saw folks in was a function of being a people pleaser and not applying the process of hedging downside risk, both best case scenario and worst case scenario. So before I elaborate on that, Nick, did you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think, well, yeah, maybe, because this is something that I recognize. I always say, don't make decisions in a valley. You don't have, you can't really see what's going on, and you almost do anything to get out of the valley, even if it's go really fast in the opposite direction of what you actually want. So it's just, the imagery for me is like, we all have, especially visionaries. Most people on this call, really bright people, are really cyclic in nature, and they have pretty consistent valleys just built into their personality. And so just being aware of that's really, really important. That sometimes your business may be doing great, but you're in a personal valley, and we still don't want to make decisions necessarily in a valley.
That's right. Yeah. So what I mean specifically, to give you a few examples of the people pleasing, one person with their business, this was pre-coronavirus and all this, about a year ago, they had a drop off in the amount of new business that was coming in, and they thought it was an SEO issue, and they thought that they could solve that problem in the medium term, short to medium term. But to then address that issue, what they did is they moved their staff to be paid per client rather than salary. And because they were moving them to being paid per client, what they did is they were essentially, they felt bad about that move. And so the rate in which they were paying per client was higher than what they were paying before under the salary framework, the average rate per client. And so while they were trying to reduce their risk in the sense that they were paying potentially these folks less, in totality, they were paying them more relative to the amount of clients that they had. And so what happens is that their margin was a lot less. And now as they've tried to scale up, there's just less money on the table for them, and they actually have to add significantly more clients to be in the same place that they were before this problem happened. So while they reduce the risk of what happens when I lose clients by moving from a fixed structure to a variable structure, they actually made their margins less because they felt bad asking their staff to move to a different model. And so they created this new problem, right? Which is we have lower margin per client, and consequently it's much harder to scale. And so and so that's just an example of being a people pleaser, where you're negotiating with yourself, and I feel bad about having to ask them for a pay cut. And so as a result, I'm going to effectively give them a pay cut, but they're going to make more per hour or per project. And what we want to do in these situations is cut the problem in half. And what I mean by that is that we're trying to solve this entire issue at once. But what if we could make the problem into two pieces and try to solve those two individual pieces, or four individual pieces? It doesn't just have to be half, but if we can break this into smaller chunks to solve the problem. And if our ultimate goal is that we do not want them to take a pay cut long term, but also we have to acknowledge that we've lost clients, but we think we can recover from that, then what we want to do is create a scenario where for, say, the first half of the work, say they were working on average 40 hours per week, and now they're going to move to 20 hours per week. It's not necessarily a straight line where we just cut their costs in half. In fact, we may reduce the cost even a little bit more than 50%. But on the second half, the second 20 hours, we're going to pay them more, or we're going to give them some bonus. So maybe we cut the rate in half. But ultimately, we need to align incentives, which is we can't take a cut in margin. And if we win, then they can win. But if we lose, they can't still win. And this is the problem oftentimes, is that we create these scenarios where we carry all the risk. And if we win, they win. But if we lose, they still have an option to win. Nick, does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, I think a lot of people are going through this right now, especially as they have people on salary that they're cutting back. So I've talked to a few people about it, so I can see it. Like, I've had these conversations, and I can see how this is happening.
Yeah. In feeling bad about the situation, we negotiate with ourselves. And so we cut their pay, but then we also set this scenario where they can still win while we lose. And that's problematic in the rebound. And so we need to be mindful of that and create the incentives that align with the ultimate outcome that we want. So we cut their pay, commiserate with the amount of hours, and maybe we reduce it even further so that our break-even point is lower. And this is back to kind of the contribution margin calculation. And then we give them upside on the bounce back, or we give them upside if we win, if we hit a specific target. Had another conversation with a client that was asking about profit sharing, and their team had inquired about it. And their business hasn't been affected, at least as of yet, by the coronavirus. Fortunate for them, and they had some conversations about profit sharing. And the single biggest problem with profit sharing that happens, that I see time and time again, is that the reason why the business owner wants to do it is they want to retain their employees. They want their employees to be happy. And then ultimately what they want is that they want their employees to take on a little bit more of the load. And so they offer this profit sharing thing with this notion that by you getting cut in on the profits, you're now going to be motivated to do more, and you're going to be happier and stay long term. And then what ends up happening for many of the business owners is that by their very personality being goal-oriented, they're going to make sure that whatever that marker is that they've set happens no matter what. So consequently, they put in all the effort to hit this, whatever the target is, to trigger profit sharing, because it's a target that they wanted to begin with. And now their staff puts in gets that profit sharing bonus, but they often didn't necessarily do any additional work. And maybe they aren't any more loyal than they were before. And so then there's some resentment by the business owner. And I'm curious if anyone in this group has experienced this. Now I feel resentful. I offer this profit share. I'm giving you this cut, but actually I did the same and maybe more work than I did in the past to hit this goal so that you could be rewarded with this profit sharing output. So I'm curious if anyone's experienced this. I've seen it pretty repeatedly in the attempt, again, just to clarify, in the attempt to incentivize them, you end up doing the same or more work, and they get the profit share no matter what. And so Similar to the other example, we need to split our ACEs and create some additional criteria. So it can't just be that we hit some monetary number where you get this profit share. There needs to be some other qualitative things. What do you really want? Like your hours maybe need to go down, you the business owner. Customer service scores need to be a certain amount. They need to hit a certain number of billable hours. There needs to be, so on and so forth. It needs to be some qualitative things that actually align with your real reason for offering them profit sharing. It cannot just be some singular monetary number. That's where we're kind of splitting the problem in half and acknowledging that even under the best case scenario where everyone gets profit share, and that means that our company hits some new milestone, even under that best case scenario, there's still downside risk. Downside risk being you're doing the same or more amount of work while they're also doing the same or potentially less and being rewarded for your output. Nick, anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'd be shocked if everybody on here, because I'm looking at the names and it's a bunch of experienced business owners, hasn't gotten into that place. If you're not careful about incentives or even just, let me look at my notes here, giving them upside on the bounce back or the win, it starts to feel a lot like maybe you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Mm-hmm. Or the resentment. I'm guilty of it in my last companies as well. So I'll just share that is that I want everybody to win. And we gave people a fair amount of phantom stock, right? So there's upside there. But what happens for me anyway is I'm pathologically stubborn enough that if I say I'm going to do something, I will probably do it even at harm to myself. Mm-hmm. I think it's very, very common with people that started something from 0 to 1, like are going to make it work. And you look back and the return on your time and effort has diminished tremendously. Mm-hmm. So there's a great risk. I would not be surprised if everybody on here, as I'm looking at these names, has felt this.
Yeah.
And Alistair says the alignment bumpers wise of your personal goals. So what I do now, just to piggyback off of that, what Alistair said, and Dan before that, is I will incentivize. And Dan's experience as he's seen me talk to people. We've done stuff together, and he's talked to some of my employees. I will incentivize, but I have to live within my own bumpers too. Like if you're getting X% of this, then I cannot work on it over the weekends. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to give the upside. So it's really a process of there's some boundary stuff. There's some personal boundary stuff.
Yeah, chances are it goes back to your profit priorities. The reason why you're offering this incentive is you're trying to expedite the process of the timeline for funding your profit priorities. And so what is number one? What is number two? What is number three? Chances are there's some element of time or quality of life, and there's some element of financial stability, and then some element of something tangible, like you want a house or a car or so on and so forth. These are just generalities that I've seen from the data. And so that chances are that the reason why you're offering these incentives to begin with is you're trying to shorten the timeline for you funding your own personal profit priorities. And so why not rig the game to win? After all, that's what we're all about here, and make sure that we've added the qualitative elements to our profit share or to our incentives that align with those. So if your number one priority is more time, then you can't give someone a profit share if you're still working the same. If it's financial stability as well, then if you're not generating more cash as well as less volatility, then you can't offer this. So often we look, profit share is this binary thing where we look at the end of the year and we go, okay, I made more than last, so I have to pay out this bonus. But what was the road to get to making more than last year? Was there an incredible amount of volatility during the year, so you had to work harder or longer hours or more intensity to generate that additional cash? If so, that's an indicator that there's more risks in your business. And so it's not usually just making more, it's making more on a risk adjusted basis. So we made more with less risk. So aligning those incentives. And with respect to the whole, like cutting the problem in half and reducing pay, to kind of get more specific into that, we want to go back to our contribution margin calculation, and we want to take our fixed cost divided by our profit margin, and that tells us how much we need to generate in sales to break even. So we need to go back to the contribution margin and see what is our current break even. Now, ideally, what we're doing right now, because let me step back and clarify. So we go through the process where we look at our contribution margin and our break even point, right? And we see that, and then we go and we look at what is our committed revenue. And what I've told you guys in the past is we look at contracted revenue. And then if we have a preponderance of data, we can forecast out what we can expect future revenue that's not necessarily committed to be, but because we have enough data that we can use an expected value calculation to get reasonable confidence on how much revenue that we have. Well, the challenge right now is that historical data doesn't apply to this period of time. And when we don't have a preponderance of data, then that means that we can't rely on that forecast. We can only use committed revenue. And so actual contractually obligated revenue. And even then, some of that might go away. So you might want to apply a discount to your committed revenue. So we should compare our committed revenue to our break-even point. And to the extent to which we cannot cover our fixed costs currently, then the action is that we need to cut those fixed costs. We go back to that whole framework where we've compiled our expenses and we're assessing and we're determining what is core and what is not. And then we're eliminating those costs that don't necessarily have a savings associated with them. So we go through that whole methodology to figure out how much can we reduce, and we're going to bias towards reducing the fixed costs first because they're fixed. They're going to happen no matter what variable hopefully is tied to revenue. So if more revenue comes in, then that's when we're incurring those costs. So we want to see, can we push our fixed costs down low enough without changing anything else in terms of how we pay our employees, et cetera. What can we reduce with irrespective of paying our employees fixed cost wise, and can we get it to a break-even point given committed revenues? Then if the answer is no, that's when we're then to the extent to which we cut our or restructure our employee's salary, our contractor salary, needs to be that we can get to break even with our current committed revenues. Otherwise, we're in this paradigm where we're bringing in money just to be in break even. That chasing the tail is exhausting for folks. Where I know of a number of people who've come to me initially as clients where they're in this loop where every month, the first 20 days or so of the month are bringing in clients just to cover their current costs. And so it's the last few days of the month when they actually have some amount of revenue that's profitable. That's exhausting. That's absolutely exhausting to be spending the bulk of your time just trying to cover your initial costs. And then you're a very fragile business in the sense that when that revenue stream goes away, you're getting crushed. So we want to reduce pay to get to at least break even, and ideally break even plus paying yourself your minimum tolerable salary. We need to reduce pay relative to the current committed revenues. And from there, then you give them upside to the extent to which new additional revenue comes in. Beyond break even, they get some additional pay so that if they ultimately work full-time or the business gets restored to where it was in the past, that they're going to make the same. Does that make sense?
Yep. And that as far as the contribution margin, calculator should be in the cash flow engineering workbook, correct?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep.
Cool. You want to hit some of these questions?
Before we do that,
Yeah.
I have some other material, other notes that may stimulate some additional questions, and it might also answer some of the questions that we already have. So, question for all of you, including you, Nick. How have the actions you've taken in the last 6 weeks been different than the actions you've taken previously? So what I've noticed is that there's some serious mental accounting bias that's been at play for folks. So you can Google mental accounting bias and watch this Khan Academy video. I think we also have it linked in the member site to elaborate on this. But it's the idea that labeling or bucketing money impacts the decisions that you make. So when money is all bucketed into one account, we have a really hard time kind of allocating those funds in a consistent way. It's all just kind of fungible. It's all in one spot. But when we start bucketing it, earmarking it and saying, okay, some of this is going to be carved out for salaries, some of this is going to be carved out for operating expenses, some of this is going to be carved out for investments, suddenly it allows us to get a bit more clarity in terms of how we're spending money. What I've noticed is that folks are treating these PPP and disaster loans in a way that's different than how they're treating revenue. So somehow getting a $200,000 forgivable loan is being treated differently than $200,000 in revenues. If you got $200,000 in revenue today, you would take a different action than getting $200,000 in a forgivable loan. But I guess then why is that the case? Why is a $200,000 forgivable loan causing you to take different actions than $200,000 in revenue or $200,000 in profit, maybe more comparably? And so they shouldn't. If both are the equivalent of getting you $200,000 in cash, the actions that you take should be the same. But by labeling something as profits versus labeling something as a loan or forgivable loan, somehow in our mind it triggers a different set of thoughts and actions. And this is where we take on potentially unnecessary risks because we have the same scenario. I guess not a problem getting 200,000 in this example. We have the same scenario, getting 200,000 as a forgivable loan and 200,000 as profit. Same exact scenario, yet we're taking different actions. One person gets 200,000 in profits, and they've got debt, and they don't take that 200,000 and pay off some of that debt. They take all that out and they use it to buy a house, or they go, once I get to 500,000, then I'll pay off that debt. And then somebody else gets this $200,000 forgivable loan, and they go, you know what, I should take that 200,000 and allocate it towards paying off some of my other debt. Because this thing over here was labeled as a loan that was forgivable, and then it triggers, oh, maybe I should take that and apply it towards debt when it gets forgiven. And so suddenly there's this different set of actions that we're taking, although arguably it's the same. Does that make sense, Nick?
Yeah.
Sometimes things make sense in my head, but I don't articulate them very clearly.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. Because I mean, one, it's real for everybody, but really interesting to me how people label things and then just don't see the same, functionally it's the same end result. So
the label triggers the action, right? Something being called a loan triggers some action that's different than something being called profits. Profits like, oh, this is money I have to spend.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And it's a great example because it's like I said, it's so real for people right now.
So being mindful of how are you taking actions that don't reconcile or are somehow contradictory. So I encourage you guys to think about that. I'm going through this process where I'm asking myself and my partners and close confidants When you look back, so 2 years from now, when we look back at what will be the obvious home runs. I think back to during the Great Recession in 2008 onward, and somewhere around 2012, we're a couple years out of it. You look back, and you're like, "Wow, investing in real estate was an obvious home run." Right? Why didn't I think about that? It was an obvious home run. Things were on a deep discount, and so, what are the things in your business or your industry that you think when you look back 2 years from now will be obvious home runs, like no brainers? How did I not think about doing that? That's so obvious. But you're not thinking about it now because you're in a valley and you're on the defense. 60% of businesses that survived the Great Recession last time went on offense during the recession. 40% went on defense. So when you're on defense, you're not really thinking about scoring, right? Inherently. So chances are you're missing those obvious home runs. So in your respective industry, 2 years from now, what do you think will be the obvious home runs that you're going to be kicking yourself? How did I not see that? That's so obvious. Or you dismiss other people's success because you're like, well, they got lucky because this was just like an obvious thing. I'm not talking about the exploitive things as well. Certainly there's maybe some obvious exploitive things that you can do. I'm not encouraging that. So when you look back 2 years from now, what will be the obvious home runs? How can you start getting traction on that? And then also, when you look back 2 years from today, so as of today, looking back 2 years, what were the obvious home runs that we missed? So there's companies that are well positioned right now. I was having a conversation with someone about restaurants, and we're talking about how Domino's is well positioned right now because they invested so significantly in technology. Obviously, there's a big difference between delivering pizza and a high-end restaurant, but they're well positioned now because they've made such a huge play in technology that's kind of paying for itself now. So, so what are the obvious things when you looking back 2 years ago? And the point of that exercise is to help you try to uncover, like, well, what were my blind spots? Why did I not see those things? Because I was in, theoretically, you were in offensive mode the last 2 years, not in defense because the economy was strong. So the question really is, how did I miss those things that are now obvious during a period when I was on offense? Let me know if that makes sense. I'm really using this to try to uncover what are the opportunities. What are the things that I want to potentially invest in now? And of course, I'm going to run them through the 4 lenses that I talk about, the 2 qualitative and the 2 quantitative, to try to evaluate where I and stack rank the opportunities. So I'm focusing on the one with the most impact. But as an exercise to try to uncover them, that's kind of the lead domino. That's the process that I call reimagining. So how do we reimagine our current business so that it's in a position to thrive going forward? Of course, part of reimagining can also be identifying all the downside risks, and we've talked a lot about that. And then we want to move from reimagining to retooling, and we've talked a bit about that already, which is how do we eliminate or reduce our fixed costs? How do we cut our problems in half? And we need to rely on what the preponderance of data says. But ideally, we're retooling after we've kind of reimagined. We've identified what are those things that we've missed, as well as what are the opportunities going forward. And that's what then plays into how we relaunch, how we come out of this on the other side. So it's a massive opportunity to. I hate to actually. I don't like the word opportunity in this context, so I wish I wouldn't use that word. But you're in a situation now where you can have a bit more grace to hit the reset button on things, because we're all going through it. It's a shared challenge. So use this time to reimagine and retool and not inject new risk So I wanted to share those distinguishments. Nick, before we go to questions, anything you want to add on to that?
No, those are great. I'm taking wrapping up notes here to make sure everybody can review this and relaunch. That's your R3. Reimagine, retool, and relaunch. Cool.
This might be a question for you, Nick. How do you separate making decisions in a valley from decisions that have to be made because your industry is fundamentally changing as a result of COVID-19? Is there a way to bias your decision making in a better direction despite the valley nature?
Yes and no. My opinion is yes and no. Dan, this is baked into all of his teaching. It's baked into mine. If you have not charted out, if you don't have any idea what your own natural valleys are, your peaks and valleys, then it's kind of impossible to tell. Is this industry related, or is this just my personal valley? And so these are things. It's not the answer anybody wants to hear, but we're talking to 15 people at once. Individually, it might be different. These are the things that Dan posted. The best time to recession-proof your business was a year ago. These are the things to best have. And again, COVID-19 it's a black swan. It could not have been. We could not have expected it. But as much as possible, your plus minus list, your decision trees, your personal bumpers, you really want to have those built out. Ideally, we have peaks and valleys. Anytime you're at a peak, Jeff Spencer talked about riding the wave. Great time to say, hey, if this, then that, if this, then that, if this, then that, and build your bumpers and your triggers. So it's difficult if you don't know your personal valleys and your industry valleys. It's really hard, in my mind, to figure out what is COVID-19 related outside of the obvious. Is there a way to bias your decision making in a better direction despite the valley nature? I think Dan probably has some really good frameworks around this. To me, it's still being clear on bumpers, on being clear on what you are not willing to do, and doing your best to say, hey, look, let's lay out the decisions. Okay, this decision has me working weekends, which I refuse to do. This decision has me doing XYZ, which I refuse to do. For me, it's kind of a process of elimination. Are there any decisions here that allow us, that don't push us into something we previously determined we were not willing to do? Generally speaking, it becomes pretty clear. If every scenario that you could possibly think of, every decision you could think of, pushes you outside of your bumpers, the things that you have decided you're not willing to do, that's a whole nother conversation. And then for me, again, it's a process of, okay, so I'm going to have to do something I previously determined I wasn't willing to do. Which of these scenarios has the light at the end of the tunnel that's the closest? So I said I would never work weekends again. I'm going to have to, but this is the scenario based on the data, the information, whatever I have, that I get out of doing that as soon as possible. So just circle back, by being crystal clear on, I'll give you an example, Alistair. There was at one of our second network event, there was a team vote. So it was my partners and staff. And I walked outside afterwards and I said, I'm not going to do that, because I committed. I said, I'm not willing to do, at this point, I'm not going to start anything I'm not willing to do forever, and I'm not willing to do that forever. And they said, okay, then we're not doing it. And so just being clear on those things. So when decisions come up, we can say, nope, there's too many options. Every day there's too many options. So for me, it's, again, just recognizing the things you refuse to do, and then running everything through those filters. And hopefully there's a few decisions still on the table, or a few options still on the table, if that makes sense.
It does. I've got a few thoughts on what you just on that question as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you bought me time, so I appreciate that.
Yep.
Back to the notion of whether or not, or how you separate making decisions in the valley from decisions that are industry related. I think it's fair to conclude that we are all in a valley currently, in the sense that emotionally, in 1 minute we feel fine, and another minute it feels like the walls are closing in and we're getting stir crazy from being locked in our house for extended periods of time, with some unknown time horizon. So I think all or almost all of us are in an emotional valley currently. And our industry may have fundamentally changed or has fundamentally changed. So what we're trying to do is make whatever is the right path, given our priorities for our business, that isn't being overly controlled by our emotions and basically short-term thinking, really, more than anything. We're trying to eliminate playing towards short-term outcomes. We're trying to play the long game, really. And so we're all in an emotional valley. I think we can just assume that's the case by default, as a way of kind of moving forward. And then I think with that in mind, what is the typical incubation period that you have from idea to final idea? So what I know is that it usually takes me 5 months if I'm going to do something completely new, from the time that I come up with the idea to when I actually figure out what it is that I really want to do. And so I don't want to lock myself into something on day one, because by day 150-ish, that's going to be kind of the final answer. And it may have mutated 27 times over those 150 days into something completely different, or it may have just mutated slightly. And so we're only marginally off. But I don't know whether it's going to be a marginal difference or a massive difference. And so I need to assume a massive difference, and not really lock myself in. So to agree, you need to, if you're going to do something wholly new, I think you need to understand what your incubation period is. And the way that you figure that out is it's kind of an archaeology project. You need to go back and dig and figure out, look back historically on all the new projects and things that you've come up with, and chart out, here's roughly when I came up with the idea, and here's when I had the final version of that, and try to chart all those out and see if there's any trends, similar to the way that we look at our revenue trends. Are there any trends in terms of the incubation period that we have? Because we're trying to figure out when our instincts align with what we actually want. And sometimes our instincts are controlled by our emotional state, or oftentimes, especially in this valley. So I look back and see kind of what that incubation period is, because we might overcorrect in period when we think that we're doing something that's fundamentally necessary. So those are some thoughts that I have in terms of the way that you try to avoid your own emotions taking over. It goes back to the principles and the frameworks, but also I'm a proponent of, I'm blanking on his name, the guy who wrote the book Principles, where he talks about
Ray Dalio.
Thank you. And he talks about what is that term? Maybe you know what it is, Nick, where you need to have basically rapid transparency. He kind of talks about this idea that you got to have people giving you honest, harsh, transparent feedback.
Yep.
And
radical transparency.
Thank you. So you need ideally to have a team of people who are going to afford you radical transparency.
Yeah, really powerful. I love his trading cards, his like employee staff trading cards. One more thing about the incubation period is Dan and I are both similar, but I think humans, we circumnavigate naturally. You kind of mentioned over rotating. I think we do that. We over rotate one way and then realize that, oops, and then we over rotate the other way. So it may not be time. For me, it's like a certain number of over rotations that, so it might be 3 or 4 years, like it was for Inception, the remote training program I did. But I know that I'm going to overshoot it 3 or 4 times in each direction. You know, I'm going to be too passive, and then I'm going to be too controlling. I'm going to circle back and be a little bit less passive, but still too passive, and I'm going to over rotate a few times. And so, being aware of that cycle too, your circumnavigation cycles.
Well, in the execution part of the case framework and cash flow engineering, we talk about doing this kind of archaeological dig to go back and effectively identify what are any new principles that you need to adopt. And so once you've done this archaeological dig over like your own personal incubation period, your own personal kind of rhythm of things, and you identify like, oh, usually in the first iteration I'm too passive, and then I move to being too aggressive, and then I move back to being too passive, or whatever that framework was that you identified, Nick, that you've gone through. We're trying to shorten that duration and cut out those peaks and valleys. And so ideally we can create a set of principles then if we know we're going to be too passive and then flip to being too aggressive, which is the most common framework: chaos, rigid, chaos, back and forth, right? That's the most common framework that folks go through. And in between, there's a story that we use to translate, being too rigid. Okay, here's why I need to be too aggressive. Right? And so the principles is supposed to be the new lexicon, the new tool that we're going to use so that we don't over rotate either way. And so using the archaeological dig, evaluating your own incubation period to effectively adopt principles that will shorten that cycle, eliminate the over rotation.
Yep. Jackie says over rotation. I like that. I think it's really important. I actually taught this at an event, and I didn't realize, because I worked so hard on it, that there was a time where I was unaware of it. And it's really important, and it's okay. And you can, like Dan said, you can shorten these feedback loops and prevent from over rotating with concepts and principles. But I think it's important to know that it's okay, that like the chaos, rigidity, it's natural. It's going to happen. Eliminate the guilt and shame and just build in the frameworks to shorten the time frame from where you start to where you want to be.
Yeah, we're almost pre-programmed for this over rotation, right? Because we either fight or flight.
Yep.
Like
yep. Very, very
equivalent almost to chaos versus rigidity in the sense of the.
Yeah, most psychologists, that's where I got the language, is humans are circumnavigating creatures. We need to aim at something, and we will just over rotate until our average is close to where we need to be. All right, let's get to Alistair here, because we're coming up on time. I think quality of life and time are the single most forgotten things when incentivizing employees and getting them aligned with the company objectives. Do either of you have suggestions about the best practice for structuring those things? And all I'm going to say, I'm going to let Dan jam. I'm going to say the profit priority framework, honestly, because we go 8 figures, let's get to 8 figures. And Dan hammers this home with better language in a million different ways. It has to be, what does that 8 figures represent, right? If you keep those profit priorities front and center, I think it becomes easier to incentivize employees in a way that serves you appropriately.
Yeah. Well, the way that I would evaluate my financial advisor, if I had one right now, it's me, for better and for worse, I guess. That's not entirely true, but would be, okay, you got me a 10% return, but how did that compare on a risk-adjusted basis to last year? In other words, in order for you to get me this 10% or 12% or 20% return, did I take on substantially greater risk? And then could I have gotten the same rate of return had I invested in things or took other actions that were less risk? And if the answer is yes, then we'd say, well, we could have done a better job because we unnecessarily took on this risk to get this rate of return. We didn't need to take on the risk that we did to get the return that we did. Does that make sense, Nick?
Yes.
And so if I'm evaluating the state of my business, then I'd want to be able to do the same, which is, okay, we grew 25%, but how much did we, that's just an arbitrary number, but how much risk did we take on to do that? And in previous years, when we grew by 25% or some comparable number, or we grew by 40% or 10%, how much risk did we take on to do that? Because if we grew by 25%, but in the past, but with 3 times the amount of risk, then arguably the quality of the work that we're doing is decreased compared to previous times. And we want to understand why that's the case, right? And so ideally, the way that we're aligning these kind of bonuses and et cetera is on a risk adjusted basis. So we want to be able to see, yeah, did we hit a specific, target financially? Did we hit some specific qualitative things that correlate to long-term success? We know that long-term, if customers are really happy, they're going to stay with us. So what are the things that we know that are going to be kind of corollaries for long-term? So we don't want to pay someone for short-term execution. So what are a couple of those qualitative things? And then what are a few of the things that relate to our own profit priorities? Are we working less, et cetera? But ultimately, we need some final metric that looks at our the risk adjusted evaluation of our company. I call that financial readiness. I have an algorithm for doing that. That's going to come out eventually sometime this year that you guys can adopt as well. That will be built into the Certainty app. So some of you bought my book that's coming out soon along with the app. And so some of you have lifetime access to the app when it comes out soon. But basically coming out with my own version or sharing on a more public basis how you can evaluate risk through a score that trends over the course of the year to look at your overall readiness, which is basically how are you able to take on more opportunity, which said another way, if you have less risk or the same amount of risk, you're more likely in a position to take on more opportunity than if your score is going down. So I use long story long financial readiness as this overarching kind of metric to look at the business on a risk adjusted basis using ongoing data. So that's my answer to that. Nick, anything you want to add?
No, I love the concept of readiness. I find it, obviously the Oura Ring, the first time I was introduced to it, but Jeff Spencer, well before there was an Oura Ring, has been using readiness to prepare athletes. And I just keep finding it amongst really bright people in their industry. It's a very, very important metric that most people don't know about, is the concept of readiness. So I'm looking forward to the app.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff made a fantastic observation point in our interview last week, where he's like, when he commented that when you're at your peak, that's probably the moment when you should stop. I'm paraphrasing, and enjoy it. But oftentimes that's when people go into like, I need to 10x, and they Randy Massengale would call it pulling a heart popper, and you can go back and listen to that video as well. But it's this idea that we rather than enjoying the moment, we try to double down, triple down, and that's when things blow up. And then there are all these lagging indicators. So when we start having health problems, when our bank accounts start to dry up, those are lagging indicators of there being a problem. There was some indicator prior to that, much sooner, that was telling us to stop, that we were ignoring. So yeah.
Perfect. We'll get one more before we run out of time here. How much of the businesses survived playing offense/defense is confirmation bias, and how much of it was general culture and mindset?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm sure there is a certain amount of confirmation bias built into that inherently, but I would say even if the data is somewhat skewed by confirmation bias, I think the overarching takeaways is the same, which is that we want to understand what were the things that we missed in the past and what are the things that we're going to look back on that we know, what are the things that we can say now we missed and try to uncover why we missed them. And then what are the things that we think will be huge opportunities when we look back a couple years from now, 2 years, 5 years from now. And then how can we reimagine our business? How can we set ourselves up in a position to be able to execute on that now while hedging downside? So I'm always playing defense in the sense I'm always when is the best time to hedge risk? Always. We can't go back and recession proof. Those are somewhat different concepts. Part of recession proofing is hedging downside risk. But we're always playing a certain amount of defense by hedging, but we also need to be playing offense. So it's not an all or nothing. It's both. Just ideally, we're on offense more than we're on defense. That's the whole idea of asymmetric risk, where the upside is greater than the downside.
Sweet. I was making notes there. I'll make sure you get a replay. I just told Dylan, make sure that you get the replay and the notes. I think the notes are going to be super valuable for this one. We have office hours tomorrow, and we have revenue multiplication on Thursday, as per usual. Anybody that you think would benefit, just make an introduction, invite them in. A lot of collective momentum, people coming in asking questions, benefits everybody.
Yeah, so for those of you who are here for a CFE and you don't, the way you can get access to Thursday is if you have the Platinum Pass, essentially, Platinum tickets. So if you don't have that and you want to tune on Thursday, let us know. We can kind of get access to it.
Yep. You reply to any email you get or reach out on Facebook, drop in the Facebook group. Make sure that you have access to that because we're start talking about revenue streams and probably how to utilize some of this reimagine, retool, relaunch framework, and obviously the four filters that we talk about all the time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I'll emphasize is that it's the same framework. Because if I create a new framework for revenue, then I have for cash flow engineering. I mean, that doesn't make any sense because revenue is a component of cash flow, right? If you don't have revenue, you probably don't have any cash flow. So same methodologies, just applied to a different problem. So you'll notice some similarities, but there will also be a fair amount of new stuff like the Maslow's hierarchy of revenue and the ascension ladder and how we flip the revenue pyramid and some other cheesy things that I have, cheesy acronyms. So more cheesy acronyms, more cheesy principles. So awesome.
Cool. You guys need anything, just let us know.
All right. Thanks, everyone.